Harry Beck was a young electrical draftsman working in London during the 1930s, but he can't possibly have imagined that one day his little map would turn into this. For souvenir shops on London's Oxford Street, Harry Beck's map is a big seller. It's on absolutely everything. Tea cosies, thongs, aprons. More than any other map I know, this one has transcended its original purpose.
Before Beck, tube travellers made do with this, meandering underground lines laid over a confusing sprawl of surface geography. In contrast, Beck's schematic diagram emphasises simplicity and order. He uses the old orange central line as his horizontal axis and diamonds to show interchange stations. Lines don't crash into each other, they intersect, and stations stand at equal distances apart. Travel in London, it says, is easy, wherever you're going.
Living in London, you take the tube for granted, but I remember the thrill I felt when I first rode the Underground as a child. The long descent down the moving staircase into the underworld, the roar of the wind being pushed ahead of the train as it hurtled into the station, and then that short, careering ride through dark and twisting tunnels. Every tube ride was a journey into the unknown.
Harry Beck had worked for the Underground as a freelance, but at the time he made his new map he was actually unemployed. Mulling it over at home, he got it into his head that the old tube map was hopeless, showed too much of what was above ground and was difficult to use.
What he had in mind was something far simpler, based on the wiring diagrams he was drawing for his day job. Instead of wires, Beck drew tube lines, and instead of electrical components, he drew tube stations. It was a brilliant, revolutionary idea. A map without measurements, wiring diagram, shocking thought. Beck's map was rejected for being too revolutionary. That was in 1931. The following year, he submitted it again, but it wasn't until 1933 that his Underground bosses decided to give it a trial run.
Even then, they continued to issue the old-style maps with street names and surface geography, so they weren't at all sure Beck's would be a success. We don't know much about how this extraordinary commuter made map-making history. But I'm hoping the fantastic privilege of seeing his original tube map will gain me an insight into the real Harry Beck.
This is the original hand-drawn presentation sketch that Harry Beck came up with in 1931 and presented to the Underground as his big new idea. This is the only example of a really key design coming up from the ranks, if you like. This was a lowly employee who came up with a brilliant idea, which initially those in a higher position on the Underground clearly were not very keen to accept.
And he made a decision of some genius about the Circle Line, didn't he?
The Circle Line, yes, which in those days, right back from its originations, had been called the Inner Circle in those days, was jointly worked by the Metropolitan and the districts, and it's shown here as just the lower bit is district in green, and the upper bit is Metropolitan. It wasn't until after the war that they actually changed that into its own line, the Circle Line, which is the ring around central London.
I noticed that there are quite a few places on this map where names have been changed.
There are, especially on the Piccadilly line, where they closed some of the stations in the central area in order to speed up journey time from the outside. And that's why Beck has already begun to make some adaptations of his sketch here. He's already had to rename what was Dover Street Station, which became Green Park, and Down Street Station, which was between them there, has disappeared completely, and that's the reason that this particular section looks a bit messy.
Perhaps the best way to understand the design of a great map is to try to recreate it. That's the challenge designers of today's tube map face every time there's a new line or a station changes its name.